The following program is a co-production of WLIW 21 and WNET 13.
Back then, New York needed broad shoulders, strong arms, and stout hearts, for the city was building itself into the 20th century. They came willingly from the four corners of the earth, hundreds of thousands of them, risking everything so that through hard work and determination, they could shape better lives for themselves and for their children. The immigrants came to a strange and intimidating new land, without language, without the means to survive alone. They clung naturally to those who spoke the same tongue, ate the same food, and shared cultural values. The need for people to be with their own was the driving force of New York's neighborhoods. As they built those neighborhoods, they began to transform New York into the jewel of America's golden age and the envy of the world.
My building, where I was growing up, is still there, 53 East 110th Street.
31 Powell Street.
22 Morris Park West.
Hester and Ludlow.
72 Barrow Street.
Number 7, President Street. She met my father. His name was Isidore Brody. Her name was Anna Rose. And they got married and they were going to America, which wasn't so simple because you had to go across the frontier, which was illegal. And this was dangerous because if you were seen, if you were caught, they would shoot you.
My family comes from the region known as Tuscany, which is about 30 minutes from Massa Carrara, which is where all the marble comes. And people from that area were great stonemasons because the only thing they had up there were big rocks and big mountains.
My father did not come here legally. He jumped ship, what they called. He was a steward on the Holland American line.
My parents, who are now both deceased, were wonderful people. And they came here as immigrants. They didn't know one another. They came from Poland.
We thought the communists was going to come. So we said, we better move and get out of there. And so we came over. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
I was literally fabricated in Gay Paris or somewhere in France, and just about made it over on a boat. It was a tough crossing, and my mother was ill all the way, I was told.
I can remember being down at the West Side Piers with my father, either a White Star or a Cunard liner, taking off some cousin or nephew or niece and bringing them up to the house.
My mother didn't come to the United States until she was about 16. When she finally got to Ellis Island, it was so sad because her mother didn't know her. She had a little tag on her that said, her name, Iona Wyatt, and her mother was walking around asking everybody, are you Iona Wyatt? Are you Iona? And she said her eyes filled up with water because her mother didn't know her.
They said America was a wonderful land. A golden Medina is the terms, which means it was a land of gold.
It's like the old saying, the money just grows on trees, right? Or just pick it up off the sidewalk.
The myth of easy riches was an irresistible enticement. It became a laughable irony almost as soon as they stepped off the gangplank.
I remember when my father returned from work and saw him for the very first time ever in my life, full of soot and dirty from head to toe, and I said to myself, my God, we came to America for this.
The immediate concern of all immigrants was finding a place to live. The vast majority lived in tenement houses, those infamous cold water railroad flats. But New Yorkers, then as now, were above all survivors.
The place we took was an old brownstone that hadn't been used for many years. It was $18 a month. and we had to heat it ourselves.
Yeah, it was pretty cold. It was really cold.
It was a losing battle. Those buildings were just infested, and as I say, the bed bugs in the summer when you'd wake up crying because you'd be itching all over, and she'd come in and wake me up, and God, those damn things were skittering all over the place, and I'd already killed some because I just rolled over on them, and then the cockroaches at all times.
A great danger in crowded neighborhoods was communicable diseases that put children especially at risk. But the rough, bustling city had a heart. Volunteer organizations such as the Henry Street Visiting Nurse Service sent trained women into the neighborhoods to minister to the sick and teach preventive health care. In over 40 neighborhood settlement houses around the city, people could find a variety of helpful services. English lessons, organized games and sports for the kids, dances and other social activities helped ease the newcomers' transition to their adopted homeland.
My father was very diligent and went ahead very busily to find a job, which he found in the garment industry. And he very soon found out that he has to know English in order to know what his wages were. Because at that time, the employers would shortchange the people who they said they're grüne, which means they're greenhorns.
Assimilation was an inevitable fact of life for immigrant families. The willingness to accept it varied greatly. Some families were reluctant to discard the culture that had sustained them for so many generations. To do so felt like a betrayal.
As far as talking English at home, while we were home, that was a no-no. My mother used to say you could talk all the English you want outside, but when you come home, it's Spanish that you're going to talk.
My mother wanted to eliminate her Yiddish Eastern European accent. She paid the tutor 25 cents an hour to teach her to read and write English and to speak it well without an accent. And she lost her accent. My father never did.
There was a confidence of being with people that spoke the same language. Because even as a youngster growing up, if I didn't speak Italian, I didn't eat. So there was that real strong bondage in speaking the mother tongue. Although they did try to learn, and they did learn the American language. The thing was that in order to come over here, to migrate, you had to be sponsored. So naturally, you went where that person called you from. So it were mostly Italians. So when they called, you were called by an Italian person. And that's how the neighborhood built up.
In Chinatown, we have different groups, but basically you will always have the nucleus, which are still very close to their tradition and their culture. This will never leave. The only time you will find a situation where someone has become a little more Americanized are maybe a third or fourth generation person that's born in the country.
The neighborhood was very Irish, but it wasn't just Irish at all. There was a big Jewish component. Good number of Italians as well. Socioeconomically, I suppose you'd say lower middle class. People like my father, police and fire department and utilities and that kind of thing were working there.
Neighborhoods were more like dynamic organisms than mere physical locations. They were alive with human activity of every type. Shopping, cooking, playing, visiting friends and relatives, even gambling and stealing. Each neighborhood had a unique texture and personality. Most importantly, the neighborhood was a protector, a sacred, nourishing place where one felt safe and life was coherent. Hard work was the lifeblood of New York. Its rewards flowed from every factory and construction site, from every office and shop, into the city's families and neighborhoods, where it put food on the table and helped pay the rent.
My father, he used to work at a factory called the Gem Razor Blade Factory. That was in Brooklyn. That's why they had the Gem razors there. He was a foreman.
My father worked in an apartment building on 72nd Street, and he was maintenance, handyman, doorman. He's a jack of all trades. He did everything.
He became a salesman selling and originally newfangled inventions like the vacuum cleaner and the refrigerator that didn't have to import ice and so on.
My father was a peddler. Now you're going way, way back now. You're going way, way back. And he sold fruits and vegetables and stuff on the wagon, the truck.
Because of the large supply of skilled and unskilled workers, employers usually determined pay and working conditions, which in many cases were unjustly poor.
The women were always hard and underpaid because a lot of the women were very shy. They didn't speak up. If they bothered to ask about how much am I getting, can I get more, this one's getting more, they would be harassed with saying, well, this one, you're not working fast enough, maybe I won't even keep you.
My whole father's family were stonemasons, and of course they wanted to do precision work. And I can remember my father went for a job here, and my father was used to the old country. He would cut their own stones, make it neatly. So as he started to build this thing, they were up there building the wall, and my dad was down here. So the foreman came over and said, hey, what are you building, St. Peter's Basilica? And they fired him.
By standing together and organizing themselves into trade unions, workers won hard-fought job security for themselves and higher living standards for their families.
My father, when he first got a job in the garment industry as a tailor, the unions was very active organizing small shops. I would hear him tell my mother that he's going to a meeting, there's going to be a meeting about the union, and he'll have to find out what's happening.
Besides the church, the other important aspect of our family life, especially when involving my father's work, was his membership in the union. It was the International Longshoremen Association. It was a very powerful union that provided many services to its members. That's what we looked to and felt. The security blanket would be the union. The church would be the spiritual blanket, and the union would be the economic blanket.
I know from my father's stories to me that he had created this partnership for manufacturing with his brother Bernie, and the union wanted to organize his shop, and he fought them, so to speak. And they came in and they physically broke everything in the place. I never forgave them for that.
They became called communists because the church and the buses, they didn't really want them in, but they couldn't keep them out. And as I often told some of my friends who became priests, that Michael Quill was the one who made them, because he made their father's jobs a position.
For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us
Optimism reigned in city life, since New York's physical and economic development appeared destined to continue unchecked. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed would once again test New Yorkers' mettle. Those same characteristics that had enabled them to survive originally enabled them to rebound now. They were determined and resilient. They found strength in themselves, and they found strength in one another.
He was actually in the clothing business and lost his job completely, and I don't know how we survived. My mother, as I said, my mother worked too, so that we could just make ends meet.
There were occasions when my father told me later that he was down to his last $5. Didn't know where we were going to find food. It was incredible.
These people would come on Sundays and do all the chores with each other, cut each other's hair, or fix the suits, or fix the shoes, or what have you, and have a good dinner and have some music. And as the Depression came along, I can recall seeing men coming in, just going down to the cellar and just a place to sleep in the cold weather, and my parents giving them whatever food we had.
No one welcomed the tough times, but people found ways to get by, even to give daily life a splash of zest.
Some people called it hooch
you could smell it. If you go into a building, you could smell, it's like corn or something like that. You knew someone was making wine or whiskey. If you had a lot of money, you didn't have to resort to that. But a lot of people made it, and they didn't think anything of it because they made it in Ireland. Like certain things that is illegal here mightn't be illegal in the country you came from.
Well, Uncle Max was the most successful in those days, and he was a bootlegger. That was not considered to be criminal in those days, and maybe even today, when you look back, I don't think people think it's criminal, because it was a stupid law. And he used to make gin, vodka, I don't even know what they made, and they made it in our tub. And he also had a gun. He was very respected.
Prohibition and the Depression put their indelible stamps on neighborhood life. But the truly defining moment was the Second World War. It meant sacrifice for almost everyone, in some cases, the supreme sacrifice.
Because there was a war and there were all different nationalities and ethnic groups that were out there fighting on the fronts, that pulled a lot of people together. There were not so many differences because we had this great big anxiety all together, worrying about the war and who was winning and who was not winning, and where the front was, were they advancing. So you could stop somebody in the street and open up the conversation and say, have you heard from your guy yet? That's a universal thing across the city.
Fortunately, we were victorious. The war ended, and New Yorkers returned to their city with a profound sense of thankfulness. They married in unprecedented numbers, raised families, and prospered in the neighborhoods.
Originally, many of the immigrants that came to this country, the idea was to accumulate a little nest egg and go back. But then, when they went back, they found it wasn't the same. The cherries weren't that big. The oranges, everything, I remember my father saying, oh, everything was best of it, everything was great. But then when they went over there, let's say for a visit, they found out, hey, nothing's like the United States.
After all the trials they had faced and overcome, those first dedicated builders of the city finally discovered they belonged here in a way they had not belonged before. This was more than ever their neighborhood, their city.
We had a candy store on the corner, Mr. Clark's candy store. Next to Mr. Clark was Jack and Tony. They owned a grocery store. Mr. Clark was black. Jack and Tony were Italians. Right next to their store was Dave's Meat Market, and Dave was Jewish. Next to Dave's Meat Market was a black-owned barbershop. Right across from that, I think, was Mr. Stein. I think was a tailor. There was a Chinese laundry, and then there was a shoe shine parlor and a drugstore. That made up all the stores in the block.
Like a loving mother, perhaps too protective occasionally, the neighborhood watched over us from upstairs windows. She fed us and our friends and most of our relatives. She observed every rite of passage. All around the city, in different languages and in diverse cultural styles, neighborhood blossomed.
The Grand Concourse was the elite boulevard in the Bronx. It was more than just a boulevard. It was wide. It's 182 feet wide, lined with trees, both in the center dividers and on the sidewalk. If a person lived on the Grand Concourse, socially and economically, he had made it. On the Jewish High Holy Days, everybody got dressed up in their to the nines, in their best clothes, and the women in their fashion and furs, and would promenade on the Grand Concourse.
The Grand Concourse, you must know, was like the Champs-Élysées in those days. It was a very wide avenue, an avenue where people would go promenade. We did not have the money to live on that street. But the street we did live on was simply a marvelous neighborhood street.
The Harlem River projects, opposite the school that I lived in 1936, was one of the first city projects that were ever built up there. It was about 5 stories high. It's one of the best kept in the city of New York to this day. We couldn't live there because my father made too much money. He made 38 cents an hour.
We found a place on Cherry Street, 343 Cherry Street. Some of my shots are taken right from the window. It was a very lively area where the women would be washing their windows and putting plants out and hanging clothes, you know. It was like a show outside. Everything was happening outside. There was a watermelon wagon with the horse would come and the women would be buying watermelons and he would be saying they're very sweet and he'd slash them open.
The apartments were all being grabbed up by the people returning from the war. We managed to get an apartment on 76th Street and 3rd Avenue. There was an elevated train there at the time. It went right by the window. It actually stopped at our window. That was a stop. So it was rather noisy. But funny, you don't hear it after a while.
I recall one time I came home from school, and when I went up to my building, the landlord, or the janitor, said, Tito, you don't live here, you live across the street. You just moved this afternoon. You see, because in them days they used to give you a free rent, a month or 2 months rent to the people, to your family. So you just pack up, they had no TV in them days, and just pack up your radio, whatever, and you went across the street.
I would say Yorkville were mostly blue-collar workers. And a lot of them were housemaids or nannies. They were all 4-story brownstone, railroad flats, and all the old ladies would shake out their feather beds in the morning, and then they'd lean on the windowsill on them and watch out the window. And there was a real sense of community.
The old line Jewish families that lived basically west of Lexington Avenue over to 5th Avenue. Most of East Harlem, east of Lexington, was Italian. As you know, a large influx of Puerto Ricans after 1945. And so from 45 to about 1960, the whole composition of the neighborhood changed. East Harlem became El Barrio.
Neighborhood was a crowded brick and mortar village, remarkably self-contained and self-nourishing. It was people more than buildings and street names. Extended family, decades before the term had to be invented. Community, when there was no need to call it that. In fact, there was no need to call it anything. Neighborhood simply was.
We used to have 2 or 3 different pushcart men come around, and we lived on the top floor, so we would hear him calling, "I cash clothes, I cash clothes," and all these old clothes. And people would come running from all the apartments down, and they would buy whatever they could afford.
My mother used to hang clothes, or you had clotheslines in the apartments. You had them, that they ran from the front, front window all the way to the back. So everybody had clotheslines. The whole apartment building was nothing but just a slew of clotheslines. There was a man, in fact, that used to go through the backyards selling the rope that you used. And you'd hear him coming through saying, "Hey, a line?"
I was home in the house at 6 o'clock, and all my mother would have to do was yell out the window, "Billy." And wherever Billy was, Billy would hear that voice and he would be home. It wasn't a point that I could stay out. Darkness never caught me on the street.
We had the grandmother, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, and we all basically lived in the same neighborhood, or if not in the same building. For myself, my grandmother lived on the 4th floor. I had an aunt on the 3rd floor, and we lived on the 2nd floor. We always left our windows open, and doors open so that people could just come in, and it was very family, and even the neighbors were family.
If they saw you doing something, you better watch out. You were in trouble because your mother is hearing about it. And she is going to thank that person, take you upstairs, and paddle your behind. That's because that person saw you doing something you weren't supposed to do.
Or else she might take you up and paddle you behind. She had a lot of mothers.
That's right.
A lot of mothers.
Life in the tenement was an exciting kind of a life. You had maybe about 8 or 10 or 12 families living in one building. Everybody knew each other. There was a storefront which was protected by the store owner, which he catered, made sure that the garbage was collected. He protected that particular avenue of it, made sure that it was cleaned up, which projects don't have that kind of freedom.
We always talk about there was no television, and that was a great time because people visited. My mother would make the tea, and maybe someone would play cards. If they didn't play cards, maybe someone there had an instrument. And they came in, and you'd have music and a song on a Tuesday night.
There may not have been a lot of space for kids to play in, but they made up for that with energy, channeled in ways that tested the limits of what was possible and what was allowed.
We were always in the street. We went fishing in Central Park. We went roller skating. We did everything under the sun. We did it. We even bathed in the botanical garden here on 106th Street. We used to jump over at night and used to go swimming there. But we had the freedom of living in a community that was very, very adventurous.
The one gentleman I've always remembered was Bill Robinson. Happened to be a famous tap dancer. He used to dance with Shirley Temple, 1939 World's Fair, dancing down the steps. He lived across the street from us. And he was the kind of man that drove a Duesenberg, a car similar to what Hitler had in the Second World War. And he had a pearl-handled pistol. He built us a playground. And at night he would lock it up. They would lock the gates up, and we'd be on the street. So you know, not your kids, we climb over the fence. His window was facing the playground, and he would come out. And they said, look out, here come Bojangles. And we would hit that fence. And if he caught you, he gave us a fanny. He gave us a good shot.
It used to be so hot, and we used to open the fire hydrants. And whenever the policemen would come, they would say, La Jara, which is really O'Hara, because all the policemen at that time were basically Irish. So the word Jara is still part of our vocabulary, but it's really a takeoff of the name O'Hara. So when the police would come, they'd say, La Jara, La Jara, La Jara.
Everybody participated in everything. Sleigh riding in Central Park, that was beautiful. We had a few beautiful hills there for the snow. They didn't clean the streets as well as they do now.
Given the choice between street play and supper, most kids would never have gone home. But mothers ruled households from their kitchens. Their meals were as much spiritual events as nutritional ones.
We lived very on Hester Street. There were the traditional stores with all the Yiddish lettering that was kosher chickens and kosher meats, and lebedike fish, which means live fish. Because the traditional way of making gefilte fish is that you buy the fish live, or you buy a carp or a whitefish, and you buy it in the morning. What do you do with the live fish? You put it in the bathtub.
The Irish have a term they call a fry, and a fry means bacon and eggs and sausage and rolls and tea, and it was not a meal, it was an event. Well, after every Mass, there was a queue of people that went halfway around the block to go into the Jewish bakery and get these wonderful rolls and black and whites and jelly donuts, and I remember that so well.
See, I have a picture of my father and myself and a friend, and we're standing in front of the grocery store. I don't know which block it was. But what I find funny about it is the prices. For a pound of coffee, 29 cents. For a loaf of rye bread, 5 cents. Cornflakes, 6 cents. Now they're about $3.89 or something like that. Bauernwurst, which is like a spicy Frankfurter, was 20 cents, but that wasn't just the Bauernwurst by itself. It was with potato salad. It was a meal, a whole meal.
At one point we lived on the Grand Concourse back in 1939, if I recall correctly. We lived there for 3 months. Mom made us move back to the barrio because she couldn't get her local foods.
If I go without rice and beans for more than 2 days, I mean, I become hysterical. I mean, I need that Spanish food. I need that rice and beans. I need that arroz con pollo.
This is melanzana alla griglia. This grilled eggplant, sauteed with garlic and oil. This is questa mozzarella di bufala, che viene dall'Italia. This buffalo mozzarella, direct from Italy.
For the first time I really left home, left New York City, I decided after 2 weeks to call my mother and find out how to make fresh tomato sauce. And she proceeded to tell me over the telephone to put a little bit of oil and a couple of pieces of garlic, and you cook it a bit, and then you put some tomatoes, and then you cook it. And then after trying to get details, how much garlic, how much oil, and how much tomatoes, finally, which was a struggle, because her thinking is always, well, a little piece is just a little piece.
Leaving the nest meant the beginning of making our own way in the world. It was a process that began innocently enough and very seductively.
The only time we were able to actually date boys was by my brothers bringing in friends. That was the only way we were allowed to date. But it wasn't actually date because we weren't allowed to, we wasn't allowed to kiss or hold hands because our brothers were very strict too, besides our father.
Dating, depending who you went out with, you still had your chaperones in those days. The cousin would, or the sister would go. If I had a thing for a girl, she would say fine, and she would bring her cousin. It would take you 6-7 months. 6-7 months to get to first base.
We'd go to the ice cream parlor or the pizzeria. That was the place you went. That was the meeting place. You would go to the pizzeria and you just, for a 10-cent slice of pizza and a Coke, and you would sit there and that was a date, or go to the movies. Always in the neighborhood. No matter what you did, it was always in the neighborhood.
Well, we used to have a candy store that we would all congregate at within a block of the house, and we would just crowd into the corner and either in the phone booth or just pack yourself in, listen to the music, and 8:30, 9 o'clock, you had to go home.
All the men would sit around the bar, and girls could come alone. And what the waiters did is girls came alone, they would sit all the girls together. And the nice thing about it is when the music started to play, all the men would filter through the dining room and pick out their girls to dance with. And if you didn't meet a guy that night, you'd meet a lot of new girlfriends. You'd make a lot of new friends. You'd meet them again on 86th Street when you'd walk.
My sister worked for the FBI, and she used to come home and say, there's this nice girl at work. Oh, she's so lovely. I mean, and when your sister's trying to set you up, you know there's trouble.
I worked with his sister, Mary. We worked for the FBI. And she sold us tickets to go on a bus ride, County Limerick Men's bus ride. My girlfriend and I planned to go, and Mary was going to meet us at the bus. And when we arrived there, she wasn't there. She had changed her mind. And so there we were, not knowing a soul on the bus, but she had told her Felix and his mother to be nice to us. And so he was, so this is how we met.
But it turned out she was a dancer as well, an Irish dancer, traditional dancer. And so we were together in the Irish circle, I with the music and she with the dancing.
But true love isn't always a lilting melody that plays on.
I was very surprised to learn about the fact that my uncle was dating an Irish girl. And by the way, he was threatened by the father. They wanted to kill him, literally, because they really weren't too crazy about the Italians.
Love is often blind. Fortunately, some neighborhoods had spiritual guides for the sightless.
When I see people coming to the rectory, want to get married, only by spotting them, I say, I don't think this is going to be a good marriage. And then you ask me why. It's like a doctor, when he sees a patient right away, they visualize the situation. And when you perform so many, you don't have to go too far to realize if this is going to be a good or a bad marriage.
All neighborhoods could do was give people a reason to come together. They did it by providing music and dance and celebration.
The Parks Department used to provide the neighborhoods with bands, and they used to have in Central Park on Tuesday nights, Latin night. And this place used to be swarming with people. And just dance all night, right on 110th Street in Central Park.
These were the bands that I really gained my experience playing with them, see? And before I started my own band, I grew up, like they say, this particular end of the profession, you learn in the streets.
Rhythm and blues at that time is what I was doing, and it was sort of in its infancy. But what was really coming up fast was bebop. Harlem nurtured this music long before the rest of the world became aware of it, really. Because there were places to go after you left the Apollo. There was Menton's Playhouse. And it was not unusual to go there and hear Thelonious Monk, young Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster. This is where you could just go and take a seat and hear the greats and see them and talk to them on a one-to-one. If that wasn't good enough, on the corner at 8th Avenue and 125th Street upstairs, if the windows were open, you could hear the church, the Holiness Church. And there was a congregation standing on the corners listening to that. The windows were open, and you have never wanted to dance so badly as listening to the music come out the window from the Holiness Church, believe me.
There was really wonderful music on every neighborhood street. If not calypso singers or a mambo band, if not a Jewish wedding, an Irish bagpiper, or an opera on the radio wafting through the window, there was the music of the street itself. The peddlers singing their wares, the children singing their game songs, the mothers singing them home, and the beautiful counterpoint of truck horns, tugboat whistles, the rattle of elevated trains.
I used to take the train down, the subway, down to Manhattan from the Bronx. And those days it was elevated on Jerome Avenue. We had the elevator. And also what I remember is that there was pickle barrels right under the train station. And always had to have a pickle before we went on the train. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I remember it so clearly. And it was really something. It was special, and of course it's all gone.
You had a lot of fun. Harlem in those days, I always refer to it as the great protector, because it kept, while it taught us a lot of things, it still kept a lot of us safe. I mean, a lot of us were safe, and a lot of us were very innocent in those days. We relatively innocent. I mean, there were a whole lot of things that Harlem didn't feel we had to know about.
If I wanted to take a walk to see my aunt and on Sackett Street, I would go there. And if I wanted to see my grandmother on Henry Street, I'd go there. And if I wanted to see my cousins on President Street, I'd walk there. You know, you didn't have to make arrangements to be close to the family that you loved.
New Yorkers, people on the edge, people of extremes. The intensity of city life made them creative, resilient, and yes, frenzied and just a bit dangerous. When they play hard. When they love, it is profoundly. Challenged, they never back down. There is emotional power in this city that flows from the cauldron of its congested streets.
The great thing was the 40th precinct with the PAL and the CYO. They were all in their infancy then.
Then the CYO started. You know, originally you'd play one block against the other, but now you had the parish playing against the parish from another zone.
Yeah, I was always involved with the Police Athletic League. They had a guy, Patrolman Kelly, an Irish cop, right in the heart of Harlem, who we loved like a father. He worked along with Pelham Fritz when we were youngsters, and they had an organized baseball program, an organized basketball program, track and field program, and these activities really kept me and my friends out of trouble.
I got into trouble in a pool, swimming pool, and the policeman that came over to us and confronted us said to us that if we did not join the PAL, we were going to go to jail, you know. He was going to put us in jail. Of course, you know, he was kidding, but that really, you know, stuck into me.
There was some tension. There was tension building. Some gangs went from one neighborhood to another to fight.
There was a gang, a local gang called the Golden Guineas that gathered at one of the schoolyards. The schoolyard that at least was in my territory. And I resisted and never joined the Golden Guineas, and I was always looked upon with some suspicion by my peers.
On 106th Street, you'd see the Puerto Rican fellas on this side, on the south east corner. You'd see the black leadership, young people. They were over on the north west corner. The Italian guys on the northeast corner.
A few city kids actually joined gangs, but that didn't keep the rest of us from tasting the bitter fruit, envy. They had the satin jackets, the pompadours and DAs, the cigarette behind the ear. They got the hot girls. We did our homework. Gang members were mostly strut and bravado. Some, of course, were genuine wise guys.
The number guys became mafia bosses, you know, number guys. Number guys got killed, the number guys end up in jail. It could have been me, but I decided I wanted to be a fighter.
Sometimes I'd break into a store at maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd get caught every now and then. And I'd go before this judge, and he knew me so well, he would say, "What is it now, Floyd?" And I always told the truth, always.
Strange breed, New Yorkers. A potentially volatile people, full of glaring contradictions. Nevertheless, other than their sometimes confrontational manner and gruff language, the remarkable thing about them was how they managed to accommodate one another, especially given the city's crowded conditions and the closeness of ethnic neighborhoods. Like tolerant neighbors, when one group celebrated, the others stepped aside.
in September, we had Our Lady of Ramatello. And there again was a way of expressing our love, not only for our religion, but for the other part of Italy, and those traditions and heritages were kept. So it was a nice way of remembering the old country.
Most confrontation in New York is a matter of posturing, but the ability to make a stand and fight for respect is widely admired on neighborhood streets.
Every kid knew how to box. What did it take? 2 fists. Didn't take a ball field. Didn't take a street where you could run out and down. It took 2 fists. And every kid knew how to use them. It was a way of expression. It was a way of pure acceptance. If an Irish tenement area had a champion and a Jewish tenement area that was abutting it, or Italian area that was abutting it had a champion, the matchmaker would put them together. That begot you 2 groups of followers. You'd wear a shamrock, or you'd wear a Star of David. Everybody wanted that identity because they wanted to pick up the fans, because the fans in New York were so important, and the fans were almost their own. They were sui generis to each other. The Irish followed the Irish, the Italian followed the Italian, the Jewish fan followed the Jewish fighter. Monday night, you could find boxing at St. Nicholas. Tuesday night, at the New York Coliseum, which is up in the Bronx, it was the Bronx Coliseum. Wednesday night, Sunnyside Gardens. Thursday night, Rockland Palace, 155th Street up in Harlem. Friday night, Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden, which was the pinnacle of pinnacles, the Mecca.
Madison Square Garden, between 49th and 50th Streets on 8th Avenue, was dingy, cavernous, airless. Its lobby was cramped and gloomy, always crowded with bookies and ticket scalpers. Dusty statues of famous boxers of yore guarded the doors. The balconies were so high and steep, spectators worried about tumbling out. To New York sports fans, the Garden was a combination Taj Mahal and Mount Olympus.
Literally every kid that played high school basketball anywhere in any of the boroughs in the city, getting to Madison Square Garden was what it was all about.
Well, that was like, you know, the Metropolitan Opera House.
I remember once when Harry Markson told me, he used to be the head of the Garden, that he'd gone over and met the Pope. And the Pope said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm president of Madison Square Garden." And the Pope went, "Madison Square Garden, boxing."
The single boxer who captured New York's imagination more than any other was Harlem's own Sugar Ray Robinson, the stylish welter and middleweight champ who was considered the most remarkable prizefighter of his era, perhaps of any era.
Whenever I get in the ring, I want to be scared. I don't look at colors, I don't look at anything. All I get in the ring with the hope that I have a lot of fear, because I know with that fear, I'm going to fight my kind of fight.
New Yorkers were constantly learning the hard lessons of fear, facing it, overcoming it. Deep down, the fighter knows he's bound to lose eventually. Deeper down, we all know this, know that the real triumph is in the effort, fighting the good fight. It was honest effort and determination that formed the bedrock of New York's success stories.
I was not a brilliant student. Average. And I was knocking on doors and finding it very hard. And then finally, someone said, I'll hire you. And first they hired me for $15 a week before I passed the bar. When I passed the bar, they gave me $25 a week. And I think I stayed about a year. And then from there, I got a reasonably good job, $60 a week. And then I stayed there for a couple of years. And then I again opened my own practice at 52 Wall Street. And from there, the rest is history.
The irony of it all was that then I became a politician. And they felt that it's like in the old days when a son would leave to become a priest. The family would consider that a loss. That is something I don't think my father ever got over. And I don't think he ever got over the fact that I won.
I was somewhat of a mediocre student up till my junior year, and then someone grabbed me and said, hey, you know what? You're a pretty good basketball player. You might get a college education, but you got to jack up your grades. My last year, I concentrated on my grades. I became Dean's List, and I, thank God, got accepted at academically an excellent college at Holy Cross.
Finally, we did get a piano, and so I was able to practice at home. And I had the windows open. And instead of people, you know, knocking and saying, hey, stop, you know, making noise, everybody would sort of congregate and downstairs and outside my door. And when I'd finish working, I'd hear applause all of a sudden, and it shocked me, you know, in the beginning.
My parents are from Puerto Rico. I went to visit my uncle. He's about 92 years old now, and he lives in Ponce, Puerto Rico. So I said, gee, I didn't know you were a musician, Uncle. He said, yes. So he went over, he got his violin full of dust, he wiped it out, all that, took it out, you know. So he started playing, and it sounded like a cat, you know, with the violin. And now when I'm leaving, I get into the limousine. I knew he was going to answer me, so I told the driver, start the motor, man, turn on the air conditioning. I sweat like crazy. Here he comes, running out the door. Tito, 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 you didn't tell me how you like my violin. How did I play for you, you know? So I told, I lowered the watch. I tell you what, Uncle, don't tell anybody you're my uncle.
I sang on the amateur show at the Apollo Theater. I think I would have possibly gotten into about the first 8 or 10 bars of the song, and all of a sudden, the band started to come in under me. It was amazing. I could hear them, and I was scared to turn around, you know, but they started to come in under me. And I sang a verse and a half, and when I finished, there was like a silence that was kind of scary, and then all of a sudden, you know, it was like people had been sitting there and say, what, you know, and then all of a sudden, they started to applaud, and the applause was so loud it scared me. I turned around, and I ran. And Doc Wheeler kept saying, oh, no, 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 come back, come back.
To appreciate wealth, you have to experience poverty, you see. So for me to be driving through the streets after all I had been through in life, running away from home, stealing, and doing all the things that I did, and now here I am, the first man ever to regain the heavyweight champion. That was some big thrill.
What do we see when we look behind the eyes of a New Yorker? Those first immigrants had been tested severely, and they discovered in themselves a tenacious will to survive and the determination to prevail. They made their children's successes possible. We owe them everything.